Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are mighty glad to have back on our show Professor Avi Loeb. Avi is Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University, New York Times bestseller for his 2021 book Extraterrestrial, and the head of the Galileo Project, the search for signatures of extraterrestrial technological civilizations. Avi, welcome back to The Focus. Great to speak with you again.
It's my pleasure.
Avi, you and your team have recently come back from combing the ocean floor for fragments of an interstellar object that crashed into the Pacific Ocean back in 2014. Can you tell us more about this object? How was it detected, and how do we know its origins are interstellar?
So this object was identified by US government sensors, most likely satellites, that noticed the fireball, release of energy in an explosion, as a result of the object passing through the air and getting hot by friction with the air. And that's how meteors are found. It was a meteor, cataloged as a meteor, and put in a catalog that NASA compiles of meteors of this type. What was unusual about it is that it was moving very fast. And in fact, it was moving faster than the escape speed from the solar system. So it must have originated in interstellar space. And when after a radio interview on meteors that triggered my interest in meteors, where I found this catalog and together with my student discovered this object in it, we wrote a paper saying, here is the first interstellar meteor. And we calculated that it was moving at 60 kilometers per second outside the solar system relative to the local frame of the Milky Way galaxy. And that is faster than 95% of all stars in the vicinity of the sun. So it had a very unusual speed. And then the paper was not accepted for publication because some of my colleagues argued that they don't believe the US government data. And then the US Space Command under the Department of Defense came to my defense 3 years later. There was a letter issued by the US Space Command to NASA, in which they said that they looked at the data and they confirmed the 99.999% confidence that indeed this object was interstellar in origin. And they also released data about the fireball at that time, and that allowed us to figure out that it was tougher than all space rocks in the catalog, 272 of them from the solar system. And so that means that this object was able to maintain its integrity and didn't disintegrate all the way down to the lower atmosphere of the Earth, even though it was moving very fast. And it implied that, it must have originated in an environment very different from the solar system, because it's an outlier in material strength relative to solar system object. And together, combined with the fact that it was moving very fast, you might ask, well, maybe it's a technological relic, maybe it's a spacecraft that was artificially propelled and also was made of some alloy that is tougher than all these rocks that nature makes, including iron meteorites. And so to check that, we decided to go to the Pacific Ocean and look for any materials left over from this explosion of the meteor. We localized the region. The US government provided the region that is 10 kilometers on a side, and that's roughly the size of a big city like Boston. That's a big area, and we narrowed it down to a very narrow strip, roughly a kilometer in width, based on data from a seismometer on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. And basically it recorded the sound wave, the blast wave from the explosion. And knowing the speed of sound, we could tell how far the explosion was from the time delay. relative to the flash of light that was detected. And so we were able to pinpoint the path, the most likely path of the meteor, and we went there and we rented a ship that was fittingly called the Silver Star. It was made, it's an Australian ship made of aluminum. We built a sled that we dragged on the ocean floor with a cable connected to the ship. And the sled had magnets on both sides. The idea was to collect any magnetic particles that are on the ocean floor, and perhaps some of them would have originated from the meteor. And amazingly enough, we found those tiny metallic marbles, 0.5 millimeter in size, along the path of the meteor, but not very far away. When we looked far away at control regions, we didn't find many of those, but we found them concentrated along the meteor path, and they were 1 milligram in mass and less than 1 millimeter in size, and they look like marbles through a microscope. That's how we discovered them. And my daughter asked if I can give one to her so that she will put it on a necklace. I tried to explain. They look indeed very beautiful. They look spherical, and they have gold, blue, brown, or black colors, but they are so tiny, you know, the size of the head of a pin or a grain of sand. So it's impossible to thread them.
Yeah, yeah. Avi, you have to clear something up for me. You know, initially, among the fragments you retrieved, it does seem like the spherules had captured the headlines, but was there also something that looked like a wire too? Can you sort of explain to our audience what that was? Because I thought that was probably even more intriguing than the spherules themselves, but we can discuss in a little bit more detail the spherules composition later.
Right. So there were other types of objects that we found early on. One of them was a wire that was made of, and that was on one of the early runs, that was made of manganese and platinum, and you know, basically a composition that is not familiar from any human-made wires. Okay, and yeah, we were wondering how did it find its place on the magnet, and it was not magnetic, but it was probably attached to the magnet by the magnetic particles that were wrapped around it. So that was very puzzling. We didn't know what to make of it. And then we found some shards of mostly iron. Now, the shards could be simply human-made. They were perhaps you know, from polishing decks, you know, as ships went over that site, and we are planning to study them in more detail. But at some point after the 6th day, I asked, where are the spherules? Because that is what we were after, given the fact that this explosion, this fireball, released a few percent of the Hiroshima atomic bomb energy and into 500 kilograms of material. So you would expect some molten droplets to have fallen down from that material. And we didn't see them at first, but then we realized that we need to separate the volcanic ash, which dominated the materials we assembled. Then there was this black powder, and we used the mesh with a size of 1/4 millimeter that basically got rid of all the tiny particles associated with volcanic activity. And then we were able to see the bigger particles separately and looked at them through a microscope, and lo and behold, found these metallic marbles. And I still remember that when the first one was found, and the geologist in the team, he ran down, his name is Jeff Wynn, and he ran down and said, Avi, you must come. We just saw one of these spherules for the first time. And I went up and I saw it on the microscope image, and I was thrilled. And I basically hugged the person next to me who was sitting next to the microscope and saw that image first, Ryan Weed. And I knew that from my experience in the kitchen that if you find an ant, there must be many more ants out there. And so sure enough, within hours, we found many more of these spherules. And I should say just a couple of hours ago, I basically brought the materials back with me. I shipped it by FedEx and it arrived over the past week. On the first day when we came back to the US, I shared some materials with the team at UC Berkeley that has access to a scanning electron microscope and a mass spectrometer, and they are still analyzing their data. Also, I brought most of it here to Harvard University, where we have other facilities similar to those. And then I sent some portion of the materials to Germany. And I had to declare on the package what FedEx asks, that I asked me to specify the content, and I said sand, and then it asked me to specify the commercial value, and I said no commercial value. I mean, obviously it has a huge intellectual value, but no commercial value. And they got it today, actually, in Germany at the Bruker Corporation, and they have some special machinery there that, within hours, they were able to find 81 spherules, new spherules. So we found on the ship about 50, but within a few hours, using much more sophisticated equipment, they discovered 81 of them in the materials we brought back. So that's quite remarkable. And we are obviously studying the composition of those that were along the meteor path and compare them to those that were far away from the meteor path, fewer of them. And then the idea is to figure out whether the materials that these spherules were made of, those that came from the meteor, has different abundance of elements or radioactive isotopes than solar system materials. So we can infer that, for example, the abundance of rare elements is different because whatever the source is could have been closer to an astrophysical site of such rare elements, like a neutron star merger or a supernova. And it could have been quite different than the one that the solar system was exposed to in terms of distances, in terms of the event itself, how much enrichment it provided. So we can potentially tell just from the composition that it's interstellar, and that would complement the velocity information. And then also we can date the material using radioactive isotopes that have some half-life. And if that half-life is comparable to the duration of the journey, we would see it can be used as a clock to figure out how old the material is. And if the age ends up being different than the solar system age, then we know it's from a different origin.
Avi, with regard to the initial microscope images of the spherules, they kind of revealed a fascinating nesting structure reminiscent of a Matryoshka doll. Can you explain the significance of this hierarchical merging and what it might suggest about the formation process of these spherules? Obviously, you're open-minded with regard to so much, Avi, but this could also be formed by some yet to be discovered natural process, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. The simple way to understand it is perhaps the smallest spheres solidify first, and we found them on the scale of a few hundred atoms. Okay, so you have these tiny spheres that condense into solid material first, and then they could get engulfed by molten iron that glues several of those together, and then another droplet, which is bigger, even bigger, of molten iron can glue together the second generation of spheres and so forth. And that's why you end up with a nested structure like that. And of course, it says something about the dynamics of the explosion. It means that droplets collide and merge. And we saw evidence for that already on the ship, because we found some spherules to be lopsided, as if a few spheres merged together to make a conglomerate, a bigger structure. And they solidified before that structure could become spherical. Definitely droplets collided during the explosion, and it could have been hierarchical, where tiny droplets first solidified, but then were collided with bigger ones that sort of encapsulated them and glued together multiple tiny droplets. And we definitely saw that in the microscope images.
Can we just go back into one other little discovery, and that is the absence of nickel? So nickel is relatively common as an element found in meteors in the solar system. What do you think the absence of nickel actually means with regards to these objects? Yes, it proves that they're interstellar, but what are the other things that sort of jump out at you when you think, oh my God, there is no nickel in this?
Well, that's an interesting question, because one way to make iron tougher or harder in terms of material strength is to remove the nickel from it.
Right.
But one can also wonder whether there could be a physical process that would remove nickel from iron, which could happen when the elements segregate and separate from each other. And we have to explore all possibilities. And we are currently, I mean, what you're referring to is the early measurements of the composition on the ship, but that involved a small fraction of all spherules. So I would reserve judgment until we go through many more of them. And we are just getting to that now, the different teams. And I prefer to have 3 different groups that are led by experts do the analysis, because then I can make sure that they agree on the conclusions, that they also interpret the results similarly. And that gives us better confidence at what we are finding. And we are planning to put together the results from these 3 groups in a scientific paper that will be submitted for publication through peer review in a scientific journal, hopefully within a month.
Wow. Okay. Fast turnaround time, Avi. Fast turnaround time. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And we're speaking with Frank B. Beard, Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University and best-selling author Avi Loeb. Avi, can you elaborate on how exposing and embracing trial and error can enhance public trust in scientific discoveries?
Yeah. So one thing I did during the expedition was write the essays on medium.com that are sort of a diary report. And I wrote about 37 of them, and it became viral. There were millions of people following it, and they were translated to Spanish. And I received a lot of emails, some saying that it's the first time they actually witness how science is done, because it's a learning experience. You don't know what you're finding. Just to give you an example, one day the sled came back with white paint all over it, and it looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. And at first I thought maybe it's a bucket of paint that was dropped by a sailor to the bottom of the ocean, and the sled just bumped into it. But then I took my finger and swiped it and put the material in a vial, and we brought it up to study its composition, and we figured that it's actually biological. And then we checked online, and it turns out that there is this gooey material that you can bump into on the ocean floor that will paint everything in white. And so here is an example for how science works. And you come up with something that sounds reasonable as an explanation to an unusual result, and then you test it. And the fact that you're wrong, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you have new knowledge that we didn't have before. So people really appreciate that, because very often scientists portray themselves as making no mistakes. They want to maintain their reputation, that stature. They're worried that it would reduce funding to science if they were to expose the mistakes made along the way. So they prepare presentations in press conferences where, they always announce just the final finding, and just like a lecture in a class. And that creates the perception that science is an occupation of the elite, because there is a sense of superiority, intellectual superiority. Of if you know everything and you tell the public of what you know, as if it must be the truth, that brings a sense of superiority. However, if the public sees that reaching those conclusions is a convoluted process, it's a process through trial and error, through making mistakes, very similar to a detective story, that makes it much more interesting and much more human and much more relatable. So I got those messages saying, thank you so much for writing it up, because now we have a much better sense of how science is done. And also some people found it inspiring. There was a person from Denmark who wrote to me that 4 weeks before that, he had a stroke. And after reading my essays, he obtained a new meaning to his life that gives him a sense of purpose. And science can be inspiring and uplifting, and as long as it connects to the public's interest, and so it could be exciting. That's lesson number 1 from the expedition. And the other lesson has to do with the response of some of my colleagues who said, why would you go there? Why would you? It's just a waste of your time, waste of your money, and you would probably not find anything. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to do anything. I said, you can sit back and relax and just wait until I come back. And if I don't bring anything, you can say, that's what I expected. But altogether, it's a win-win situation, because I'm just seeking evidence about an interstellar meteor. And, it can only improve our knowledge about what lies outside the solar system. And I'm not taking any of the money that was used before for research in some particular area of astronomy. This is new money that was donated, added to science. And so I just don't understand this negativity, as ahead of time. And also, after we came back, there was a paper that appeared in the Astrophysical Journal by experts on Meteor saying, oh, we are trying to fit the US government data with a model about stony meteorites, and we can't do that. So therefore, the government data must be wrong. And that's exactly the fact that the regular meteorites do not fit the data is the reason I originally said that it must have a material strength higher than space rocks that we are familiar with. But they say the data must be wrong. And that's 1 year after the government, the US Space Command put their reputation on the line and said, we looked at the data, we're confident it's an interstellar meteor. So they say, no, you were wrong by a factor of 3, that the velocity was much smaller. If the government was wrong by a factor of 3 on this meteor, you can imagine them monitoring ballistic missiles with the same instruments and sensors and suggesting that the missile is heading to Mexico when it's actually heading to Washington, DC. And I just sleep better at night, because I know that I went to the site that the government talked about and I found spherules there. So, despite of what the paper in the Astrophysical Journal last week said, it also said that the meteor cannot be made of iron. And we found that these spherules are mostly iron. So, it's not a matter of opinion. Once you have material evidence, then you can proceed from there. And that's another lesson, that, that science cannot be diminished by the negative undertone that you find in social media or by academic jealousy.
Yeah. Tell me something, Avi. While you were away doing your thing just off the coast of Manus Island, we had some incredible claims made by former US intelligence officer David Grush on how much pressure did this place on you and your team to demonstrate the utility of the scientific method versus the hearsay that kind of erupted out of nowhere?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because I realized that it may be easier to figure out the truth about interstellar space by surveying the floor of the Pacific Ocean than asking the government, the US government, to release that information. What he was talking about indeed is just people telling him things, or he saw documents speaking about things, but it's not the same as direct evidence. And science is really remarkable in the sense that, you know, you are just following the facts and trying to collect new evidence yourself. And, you know, the sky is not classified, the oceans are not classified. So we can do it. We don't need the government to do it for us. And by the way, the government is not a scientific organization. So if they get access to such materials, or if they notice unusual things in the sky, it's not clear that they have the best people to make sense of those things, because they are focused on national security. But anything that comes from interstellar space, you know, has nothing to do with national borders. It should be knowledge that is shared by all humans. And that's what science is about. So I think it's much better suited for scientists. And I hope that if the government knows something or has possession of anything, as David Grush was suggesting, that they would eventually release it so that the scientists can look into it. Because it's very important for us to know our cosmic neighborhood. You know, we can, of course, live at our home and just think about what happens within our home. But I think we can learn from our neighbors. That's an opportunity. It's not a risk. It's actually an opportunity to learn.
Avi, you estimate that there are many objects like IM1 within Earth's orbital range, but they're very difficult to detect with our best telescopes. How does the study of IM1 fragments help us identify and differentiate interstellar objects from solar system meteorites? And is there a density or spectral difference in interstellar meteors that could potentially allow for better detection?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, because there are lots of meteorites that were collected on Earth, and they are in museums or private collections. Now, we don't know if any of them came from interstellar space, because we did not, for most of them, we did not witness how fast they were moving when they approached Earth. And then without that information, we can't really tell. However, if by looking at this interstellar meteor, we identify some traits of the object that indicate that it's interstellar, then we can look for the same traits, the same chemical abundances, the same maybe isotope ratios in other meteors. And perhaps there is a small subclass, because, you know, based on our statistics, you expect only 1 in 1,000 meteorites to be from interstellar space. But if we identify the differences by studying those spherules, then maybe you can do a systematic search through the meteorites that are known and look for those distinguishing features, and then we might find more. And it's basically a fingerprint of the interstellar origin that we might be missing. And there may have been a subclass of meteorites that people noticed are strange, but didn't know what to make of it. So they said, oh, there is a small subclass of solar system meteorites that have this unusual property. But in fact, this is from interstellar space. So that would be very interesting. And the other thing is, we can, at any given time, there are 1 million objects like this first interstellar meteor within the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So there are plenty of them. And we cannot see them with telescopes because they're roughly meter size, and such a surface area, roughly a meter in size, does not reflect enough sunlight for us to see them with our existing telescopes. But one can think of innovative ways of finding them, perhaps sending a space telescope for that purpose. because we want to look around and see what does the population look like. If we wait for Earth to collide with one of them, that happens once per decade. So it's a rare event, and of course there is nearly 1 decade since the first interstellar meteor was recognized. We might have another one soon, but at any event, these are very rare if you wait for them to collide with Earth.
Indeed. Avi, as you were mentioning earlier, you've got multiple laboratories analyzing the IM-1 fragments. But what specific techniques and instruments are being employed to gain a deeper understanding of their elemental composition and potential technological signatures? I mean, whatever the original shape and composition of IM-1, when it hit the Earth's atmosphere, as you said earlier, the explosive impact broke it apart and melted its original form. So how can we be certain of any technological signature left behind by these blasted fragments?
The only way to find any evidence would be from the composition that includes some rare elements. Just imagine melting a computer screen or a semiconductor. You would notice that some rare elements have a much higher concentration relative to their abundance in nature. And that's because they play a very important role in electronic devices. So one thing is to check for those and see if there are any anomalies that appear to be technological. But other than that, the best approach is actually to use the spherules as guidance for where any big piece of the meteor might be. So if we find a big piece, by using those spherules as rose petals that lead us to our partner, then we could easily tell the difference between a rock and a technological gadget, because the gadget would have a label made on planet Y and would have buttons on it.
I just had a thought listening to you. If we were to run a simulation of, say, Pioneer crashing into an Earth-like planet, or Voyager 1 or Voyager 2 crashing into an Earth-like planet, would we see something similar as an outcome to what you discovered searching for the fragments of IM-1? And would that not also be a good way of being able to determine technological signatures just in an artificial construct of your laptop in a good simulation program?
Yeah. But of course, what we can imagine are things that we sent to space. And it's possible that whatever probe was sent by a more advanced technological civilization would be quite different.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that as a template, I would consider, for example, the latest interstellar probe that we sent, which was New Horizons, and just consider New Horizons Meteor. And, personally, my dream, Elon Musk dreams of dying on Mars. For me, the dream is that I will die in a spacecraft that goes to interstellar space, and in a few billion years, that spacecraft will collide with an exoplanet, and that my body obviously will burn up in the fireball. But if there is any spheral that is left, any dust particle from my body that ends up being collected by a curious scientist on that planet that will examine it under the microscope, that would be a great honor for me, to be studied by a scientist from another planet. That will give a purpose to my life in a way. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because if there is anything in this material, I want to be the one to see it. Of course, if we find a technological gadget in one of the future expeditions using a sonar to image the ocean floor, then we can decide whether to press a button. And I asked students in my class at Harvard whether I should do that, the last class of the spring semester, and half of them said, no way, we are worried about the consequences. And the second half said, oh, of course, we would be delighted to see what would happen if you press a button. And then one student asked me, what would I actually do? And I said, I would bring it to a laboratory first to examine it before engaging with it.
Good answer, Avi. I wouldn't press that button beforehand. Anyway, look, Avi, to go onto a little bit of a trajectory here, there was a recent story issued by the Times on the 11th of July when there was an accusation leveled by the Papua New Guinea opposition leader, Joseph Lalang, that the Meteor fragments of IM-1 were stolen, and this could lead to the abandonment of a recent security agreement signed between Port Moresby and Washington. I mean, personally, I find the accusation very hard to believe, and it smacks of gross political grandstanding. But what do you say about this?
Well, we actually have been engaged with Papua New Guinea officials for 8 months. And we have an agreement with the University of Technology at Papua New Guinea to study and share results of this unique astrophysical object. And in fact, the head of the mining engineering department at the University of Papua New Guinea, University of Technology, Dr. Jim Lam, is scheduled to visit Harvard very soon and participate in our research. So I have a letter from the vice chancellor of that university that agrees to work with us on this expedition that was written a couple of months before we went there. So, you know, that is clear evidence that, in fact, we were completely cooperative and transparent, and we went through all the official channels. So, you know, there are several other things, you know, in addition to just being in contact with the official channels, we completed a research, a marine science research permit application as requested. It went through several modifications because of the unique nature of the project. The project does not fit with a typical application because it's not seeking to collect biological or geological samples. And we are outside of the Papua New Guinea territorial sea. And the project is the subject of a cabinet briefing paper that is in progress. And it's the first one in the world, this project, and with no precedents for collecting interstellar materials. The materials, the meteorite that collided with the Earth at a speed of 45 kilometers per second, roughly the size of a basketball, you know, reduced to small particles, and the total sample mass that we collected was 35 milligrams. It's less than half a teaspoon, and this is believed to be the first object from outside the solar system, and it's a huge scientific value to the world's astrophysics community, and it's a foreign object that landed in Papua New Guinea from above. You know, the meteorite particles landed approximately 100 kilometers north of Manus Island. So it's outside of the territorial sea of the Papua New Guinea, but within the exclusive economic zone. And we always sought to follow the process that was determined by the Papua New Guinea officials. So the project collected about 50 spherules, and each altogether just 35 milligrams. And the testing is done in the US because we have the instruments that are the best for that purpose, and the results will be published just like any scientific paper. So we have this visit by Dr. Jim Lam from University of Technology in Papua New Guinea, and he is coming to work with us, and we are thinking about, you know, promoting this for the benefit of science. It's knowledge that is shared, and we are happy to share also the materials that we have with other teams. As I said, there are 3 experimental teams now studying it. So there is no basis for what you just mentioned.
Yeah. It just sounded like a sensational headline story for someone who's harboring a political axe. So I don't think there's anything to worry about there.
I think it was, you know, used by the opposition to the government, and Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Avi, the study of interstellar objects through microscopes rather than telescopes opens up a new avenue for astronomy. How do you envision this shift in perspective influencing the future of scientific research and our understanding of the cosmos? I mean, once, not that long ago, there was the science of the very large, which was astronomy, and the science of the very small, which was microscopic. Are we now looking at a more evolved and holistic science of both coming together?
Yeah, I do think that, well, first of all, the fact that we found the spherules in the site that the US government reported about, to me, gives confidence that they know what they're speaking about. And I sleep better at night because they monitor the Earth for any risks from the sky. And so they measure things correctly. And there is also, of course, the interest of the US government in unidentified objects, and they established a new office in the Pentagon that looks into that. And that is something we are doing in the Galileo project. We have an observatory at Harvard. We plan to make 5 copies of it in the near future. And we are basically collecting data in a scientific way, openly. I see a way of partnership with government. I don't see a conflict because they are interested in anything produced by humans. We are interested in anything that is not, if it's of technological origin. And so we complement each other in some ways. And I do think that if there is something unusual, as long as we search for it, we will find it. Of course, the way that we keep our ignorance forever is if we decide that it's an extraordinary claim and therefore not seek any evidence for it, which was pretty much the situation until the last few years. And my claim is that extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary funding, and if we have if we are searching for it, we might find it. I'm very hopeful that in the coming years, because of the effort we are making, we will have new revelations.
Avi, if the evidence points that the IM-1 objects are of artificial origin, how do you think the public will react? I mean, I can see that this may escalate public interest in the Grush story, for instance, which is not science-based. Is there a fear that your discovery may be drowned out by conspiratorial UFO true believers, or that your discovery may be conflated to their narratives?
Yeah, that's a real risk, but that's why I follow the evidence. And if we have material evidence for whatever we claim, then it's not up to public opinion to decide what it is. The situation is similar to Galileo saying the Earth moves around the sun. And it's not up to the church to claim otherwise, because if there is evidence for the if it's the reality of the situation, then it doesn't really matter what other people say. Now, it's possible for people to amplify the scientific message, which may be limited in scope, and then make something bigger out of it. That I cannot prevent, but at least we will just follow the evidence in the scientific paper that we write, and then this paper will be shared by everyone. Anyone can look at it and realize what we are actually saying. And the fact that others are amplifying it or distorting it is their problem, and I cannot control that. I already noticed when I talk about the expedition that some reporters are changing what I'm saying and putting in a headline something that I didn't actually say. But that's their fault, and I cannot do anything about it. And anyone that listens to me speak on a podcast or on television can see what I'm actually saying, or if anyone reads my medium.com essays, then it's obvious what I'm saying. So I cannot do more than that. And my hope is that people will be more factual and more truthful to the message, the scientific message that we uncovered.
Avi, finally, I'll always remember watching live the proceedings of Our Future in Space, the Ignatius Forum at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. back in 2021, courtesy of an invitation by your good self. A friend of mine and I watched slack-jawed as we speculated that this was the beginning of a general disclosure on intelligent alien life. And what we'll do is we'll post a link to this fascinating series of presentations, both in our video and audio versions of this podcast. But what do you make of the congressional hearings that are currently happening in the US regarding unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or UAPs? How are they likely to help or hinder the science you are doing?
Oh, it all depends whether the government really has data or materials that they collected that is relevant for this question. If they don't have it, then it doesn't really matter. They can keep talking about it, but nothing will be revealed because it's all talk.
Yep.
And, this subject was full of talk for decades. So in case there is no fire behind the smoke, if it's just smoke, then, I don't really care much about it. I think it's just politics. But if it ends up being real, that the government really has in its possession some information that is scientifically important, then I hope that it would lead to the disclosure of that information, because then scientists can look at it and the public will be aware of the reality that we all share. That's our cosmic neighborhood. The question of whether we have neighbors should not be up to the decision of the President of the United States. That is not his job at the moment to worry about what happens in interstellar space. And, I hope that at some point, if we do get a disclosure, that in the State of the Union address, the President will include also the state of the universe, not just the Union. But it's really up to all humans to be aware of that. And, just like a family living at home and wanting to know whether they have neighbors. And we live on our planet. This is a piece of rock that was left from the formation of the sun. And, it would be good for us to know if other creatures like us, intelligent as much as we are, or even more, exist on other rocks around other stars. That's a very simple proposition. And if we know that there are many that existed or perhaps even died over cosmic history, but they reached technological heights that are superior to what we now have, that could inspire us, first of all, to survive long term, and second, to also to imitate them technologically. And that is the focus of my new book that is coming out next month, called Interstellar. It's just 1 month away, and you can find it in any outlet that sells books, like Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And in that book, Interstellar, I talk about the implications for humanity and why it's so important for our future to recognize the possibility that we are not alone.
I'm so glad you raised your book. I was going to sign off with, when's your new book coming out? So it was just as well you preempted me on that. Avi, thank you for joining us again on The Focus and for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me. And here is one of the vials that I have in my home office that came by FedEx a couple of days ago.
Wow. Okay. That's fantastic. Thank you again, Avi. Look forward to speaking to you next time.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And to our audience, thanks for tuning in to the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. And please leave us your comments on inquiries@sageinternational.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.